I am Arthur, and I'm 68 years old. My arrogant, entitled son used to think he could build his tech empire by stepping all over me. At our family Thanksgiving dinner, he backed me into his climate controlled wine cellar, slapped me hard across the face 9 times in a row, and shoved me against the wine racks. He called me a pathetic old loser and a parasite. He thought I was just a helpless, grieving widower with nowhere else to go. Someone who would just stand there in the basement of his mansion and take the abuse. What he didn't know, and what his trophy wife didn't realize as she filmed the whole thing on her smart glasses like it was some kind of joke, was that every single inch of that luxury property they were standing on legally belonged to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shed a single tear. I just calmly walked out to my truck, made one phone call, and completely wiped their entire existence off the map. Before I tell you how I sold their house before the turkey even got cold, if you believe that respect is earned and abuse should be met with total destruction, you'll want to hear this until the very end. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and the air in Marin County, California, was filled with the smell of expensive roasted truffles and a crisp breeze blowing in from the bay. I pulled up to the curb in my 15-year-old Ford pickup, parking in front of a massive mid-century modern glass mansion carved into the hillside. To our entire extended family, this house was the ultimate monument to my son Julian's massive success in the Silicon Valley tech scene. The wide driveway was packed with limited edition foreign sports cars, and the perfectly manicured lawn stretched all the way to a custom infinity pool. Julian and his wife, Chloe, were playing the roles of wealthy hosts to absolute perfection. Chloe was floating around the terrace like a social butterfly in a custom designer cashmere gown, sipping natural wine, while Julian stood by the outdoor pizza oven acting like a god, swirling a glass of neat Macallan. No one at that party had any idea about the reality behind the luxury surrounding them. They didn't know that 6 years ago, when Julian's first startup crashed and burned, leaving him with maxed out credit cards and a completely ruined credit score, I had stepped in. I used a blind LLC to buy this entire property with 100% cash, including the house and the commercial lot next door that he used as his startup headquarters. I did it to protect him. I set up an incredibly complex B2B commercial turnkey lease agreement, making him believe he was just paying a standard rent-to-own mortgage to some faceless commercial real estate bank. In reality, those monthly payments were going straight into my holding account. I would then use that money, along with my own savings, to quietly cover California's ridiculously high property taxes, massive home insurance premiums, and environmental maintenance fees. I built a financial fortress for my son just so he could sleep at night. And in return for my silent sacrifice, he gave me pure contempt. I walked into the backyard carrying a homemade pecan pie, using my late wife's favorite recipe. The moment I stepped onto the patio, the atmosphere shifted. My relatives, cousins, aunts, nephews, all gave me polite but pitying smiles. Ever since my wife passed away 4 years ago from early onset Alzheimer's, I'd become a ghost to this family, a tragic figure they felt forced to tolerate. Julian barely even looked at me. He snatched the pie pan out of my hands, passed it off to a hired private chef, and made a loud joke about how I shouldn't be bringing cheap carbs to ruin their high-end organic menu. I swallowed the insult and took a seat on a folding chair at the edge of the lawn, perfectly content to stay out of the way. But Julian had no intention of keeping the peace. He had been pacing around anxiously, the whiskey fueling a dangerous arrogance deep in his bones. Lately, he had gotten himself tangled up in a brutal Series B venture capital funding crunch, a high-risk tech expansion plan that required a massive injection of liquidity or hard collateral. He had already burned through all his investors' cash, and traditional banks wouldn't lend him a single dime. In his mind, there was only one source of wealth left, a portfolio of foundational infrastructure utility patents that I held. They were my life's work as a retired structural engineer and the final safety net for my medical care in my old age. I had already told him in private, in no uncertain terms, that those patents were completely off limits. I thought the matter was settled. I was wrong. Julian tapped his whiskey glass with a silver spoon, demanding silence from the crowd of over 40 people gathered on the terrace. The background music was turned down, and everyone turned to look at the golden boy of the family. He started with a toast to family, but his eyes quickly locked onto me, sitting in the corner, cold and predatory. He walked slowly across the flagstones, straight over to my folding chair, and looked down at me. He announced to everyone that true family is supposed to support one another. He bragged to the relatives about his brilliant business blueprint that was guaranteed to make tens of millions, claiming the entire plan was currently being blocked by a stubborn, selfish obstacle, me. He held out his hand, palm up, and publicly demanded that I sign over the entire patent portfolio to his company account by Monday morning. He framed it as a moral obligation. He told the relatives that since I was old, living a useless life, just waiting to die, holding on to those assets was a betrayal of the family legacy. The backyard went dead silent. I looked around, watching the faces of my siblings and nieces. Not a single person stood up for me. They just stared, waiting to see if the old man would break under the pressure. I looked up at my son. My voice was incredibly soft, perfectly steady. I told him no. I told him that those patents were the safety net his mother and I spent our entire lives building, and I would never let him gamble them away on some Silicon Valley pipe dream. The word no snapped something inside his brain. His face turned a deep, angry purple. The polished tech executive persona vanished instantly, replaced by the spoiled, vicious child he really was. Instead of throwing a tantrum in public, he grabbed my arm, violently yanked me out of the folding chair, and dragged me into the climate-controlled, soundproof luxury wine cellar beneath the main house. The heavy oak door slammed shut, completely cutting off the noise from the party outside. He slammed me hard against a custom mahogany wine rack. My back broke a bottle of vintage red wine worth hundreds of dollars, spilling dark red liquid all over my cardigan, while shards of glass cut into the back of my hand. He crowded right into my personal space, towering over me like a wild animal. He raised his right hand and slapped my left cheek with everything he had. "One," he hissed through his teeth. Calling me a pathetic relic, he slapped me again with a backhand. "Two," he called me a parasite. "Three," he said I was a leech sucking the joy out of his life. 4, 5, 6. Every strike came harder than the last, making my ears ring and blurring my vision, knocking the wind right out of my lungs as he pinned me against the edge of the rack. 7, 8, 9. He screamed that if I didn't sign the transfer agreement, he would take me to court, have me declared incompetent, strip away my legal rights, and dump me in the cheapest, most miserable state-run nursing home in California to rot. He was so close I could smell the heavy alcohol and bitter hatred on his breath. He landed the final, hardest slap, leaving a deep purple bruise right across my cheekbone. I didn't hit back. I didn't even raise my hands to block him. I just stood there, taking the physical abuse, silently counting every single impact in my head. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Chloe. She wasn't horrified at all. She was leaning casually against the wine-tasting table, wearing her latest smart recording glasses, with a massive, mocking smirk on her face. She had even pulled up her iPad, connected it to the internal security feed, and was watching and saving my humiliation in real time like it was her own personal entertainment. I thought about the silence of the relatives out on the terrace. My own brother looking down at his shoes. My cousins suddenly finding their wine glasses incredibly fascinating. They were accomplices in their silence. They had made their choice. In that exact second, the father who deeply loved Julian died. The man standing in that wine cellar was no longer a grieving widower or a self-sacrificing father. I became a machine of pure, calculating karma. I slowly stood up straight. The cellar was so quiet, you could only hear the faint hum of the climate control system. I didn't give a long speech, and I didn't threaten him back. I stared directly into Julian's eyes, straightened my wine-soaked jacket, turned around, pushed open the heavy oak door, and walked out. I walked right past the imported sports cars, through the premium landscaping I secretly paid to maintain, and got into my old truck. I turned the key in the ignition and pulled my phone out of my pocket. It was time to show my son exactly what it looks like when a real financial empire collapses right on top of your head. The drive away from that wealthy hillside neighborhood took about 40 minutes. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove in absolute silence, watching the scenery shift from the manicured, luxury lawns of my son's neighborhood to the older, more grounded streets of Berkeley where I lived. My cheek and the back of my hand were still throbbing, but the physical pain was completely secondary to the cold, terrifying clarity that had taken over my mind. For years I had been living under the illusion that unconditional love meant unconditional forgiveness. I had excused his arrogance as ambition. I had overlooked his disrespect as startup stress. I had allowed him to treat me like a liability because I wanted so badly to protect the one fragile bond we had left after his mother died. That illusion died a brutal death in the basement of his wine cellar. I parked my truck in the driveway of my modest craftsman home. The house was dead quiet. I walked straight through the living room, entered my home office, and locked the solid wood door behind me. I walked over to the corner of the room and knelt in front of a heavy fireproof steel safe. I spun the dial, entering the combination my late wife had set 30 years ago. The heavy mechanical lock released with a satisfying metallic clunk, and the door swung open. I bypassed the envelopes filled with old tax returns and retirement portfolios, reaching into the deepest, darkest corner of the steel interior to pull out a thick manila folder. It was labeled with a single phrase, Property Holdings. I laid the folder flat on my heavy oak desk and opened it under the bright glow of the desk lamp. Inside were the original notarized deeds to the luxury estate Julian and Chloe were currently occupying, along with the adjacent commercial lot. Julian's name was nowhere on these legal documents, and neither was Chloe's. The entire property was registered under a blind LLC, and I was the sole managing director and 100% owner of that company. 6 years ago, Julian was in a state of absolute panic. He was trying to buy his first property and startup garage to impress his Silicon Valley peers, but his credit score was entirely trashed. He had maxed out countless credit cards, defaulted on an auto loan, and racked up a massive amount of undisclosed personal debt during his wild bachelor years. No legitimate financial institution would have loaned him enough money for a tool shed, let alone a hillside estate. He was facing total social death and humiliation in front of his tech peers and his new bride. Instead of letting him face the consequences of his actions, I decided to catch him before he hit the ground. I bought the property with my own cash, upfront and in full. Then I set up the holding company and drew up an incredibly complex B2B commercial turnkey lease agreement. Julian was fully convinced it was a standard bank mortgage. For half a decade, my son had been writing monthly checks to a designated corporate account. He constantly bragged to his friends about the great interest rate he got and his high-value real estate investment. He had no idea that his monthly payments didn't even cover half of the actual market rent for that neighborhood. He had no idea that the corporate account was entirely under my control. Every single month, I took his meager payments, quietly added my own money to them, and paid the massive California property taxes, HOA fees, and incredibly expensive structural insurance. I was subsidizing his lavish lifestyle while he slapped me in the face and called me a parasite in front of our entire family. He truly believed he was a self-made tech mogul standing proudly on top of the world. He didn't realize that the mountain he was standing on belonged to me. I ran my fingers over the raised gold seal on the deed. The era of silent subsidies was officially over. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk and took out a leather-bound address book. I skipped right past the numbers of the family members who had just watched me get assaulted, flipped to the business contacts, and found a specific number. It belonged to a man who ran a corporate liquidation firm. He specialized in aggressive acquisitions of distressed Silicon Valley assets, hostile takeovers, and moving massive amounts of troubled capital under absolute secrecy. He catered specifically to private equity investors looking to park cash in American commercial real estate with no questions asked. In the industry, they called him a vulture capitalist. I picked up the desk phone and dialed. The liquidator picked up on the second ring. I didn't waste time with small talk or explain my personal situation. I just told him I had a prime commercial and residential mixed-use property in Marin County that needed to be liquidated immediately. I gave him the exact address, the square footage, and the details of the internal structural renovations I had secretly paid for the previous year. I could hear the clicking of his keyboard as he pulled up the property records and aerial satellite views on his end. He noted the incredibly high market value of the plot and asked about my timeline. I told him I needed an all-cash offer, and I needed the deal finalized before the sun went down today. He paused. He warned me that rushing a blind corporate transfer on a Thanksgiving weekend would require a massive financial haircut. He quoted me a figure that was a full 40% below current market value. Most sellers would have hung up the phone in disgust at that number, but I didn't hesitate for a single second. I accepted the offer immediately. The money didn't matter to me anymore. I had more than enough saved up to live out the rest of my days in comfort. Right now, the only thing that mattered was absolute speed of execution. I gave the liquidator the only non-negotiable condition of the deal. The new buyer had to take absolute physical control of the property within 48 hours. No grace period, no extended move-out date. The buyer would get a completely clean deed, and in return it was their responsibility to use their own armed personnel to lock down and take over the property immediately. The liquidator agreed to the terms. He told me he had a well-funded development company on standby looking for prime properties in that exact zip code. Their wire funds were ready, and they maintained their own security teams made up of former private military contractors who specialized in handling aggressive commercial evictions. He sent the digital transfer contracts directly to my terminal via encrypted email. I sat at my computer, reading through the legal jargon. Every single clause was ironclad. Legally, I was transferring full ownership of the LLC and all its physical assets to the development company. By signing this document, I was effectively vaporizing Julian's entire physical reality forever. I remembered the feeling of his palm slamming into my face. I remembered Chloe's twisted smile as she recorded the abuse on her smart glasses. I typed in my digital signature and clicked submit. The confirmation screen flashed, indicating the transfer was complete. I printed a physical copy of the wire receipt and slid it into the now empty manila folder. The house was completely gone. The manicured lawn, the custom pool, the high-end kitchen where they threw their lavish parties. None of it belonged to them anymore. Right now, they were sitting in a backyard owned by a ruthless corporation that would stop at nothing to throw them out. I checked the clock on the wall. It was late afternoon. The party should be winding down by now. Julian was probably pouring himself another whiskey, feeling like an absolute king who had just put his useless old father in his place. He had no idea his crown had just been ripped right off his head. But the house was only the first domino to fall. The physical foundation was gone, but I still needed to make sure the financial walls around him collapsed completely. The transfer receipt was safely put away, but my work was far from over. Selling the property only stripped the roof from over their heads. I had to make sure the ground beneath their feet shattered into pieces. I left my home office, walked over to the coffee table in the living room, and opened my personal laptop. The house was dead silent except for the low hum of the kitchen refrigerator. The screen flickered to life, casting a dull blue glow across the dark room. I opened the browser and navigated directly to my primary banking portal. I entered my security credentials and watched the screen load. A list of accounts appeared before me. For years, I had viewed these accounts as a sacred responsibility. I had meticulously managed the balances, making sure there was always enough liquid cash to catch my son whenever he tripped. Now, looking at those numbers, I didn't see a safety net anymore. I saw weapons. I navigated to the automatic transfers section of the dashboard. A long list of recurring payments popped up on the screen. Each line item represented another invisible crutch I had placed under Julian and Chloe's armpits to keep them standing tall in their wealthy social circles. The first item on the list was a massive monthly payment for a luxury imported SUV. Chloe drove a top-tier custom Rivian. She constantly bragged to her country club friends about how Julian insisted she drive the safest, most expensive electric vehicle on the market. She loved the panoramic sunroof and the heated leather seats. She had no idea that Julian's horrific credit history had gotten him laughed right out of the dealership's finance office. I was the one who co-signed the lease and set up the automatic payments from my personal checking account just so she could keep up appearances. I moved my cursor to the active payment profile and clicked the button to cancel the recurring deduction. A warning prompt popped up, asking if I was sure and explaining that missing this payment would trigger an immediate remote lockdown and repossession of the vehicle. I clicked confirm. The payment instantly vanished from the screen. By next week, the bank would issue a repo order, and her ultimate status symbol would be hooked up and towed away, no matter where she parked it. I moved down the list to the next major expense, a top-tier premium platinum health insurance policy. A few years ago, Julian had bitterly complained about the high deductibles on his company's health plan, claiming it was beneath his dignity to pay out of pocket for basic doctor visits. As always, I stepped in. I bought them a comprehensive private family policy that covered everything from boutique dental work to Chloe's expensive cosmetic dermatology appointments. I paid those sky-high monthly premiums without a single complaint. I clicked the link to the insurance provider and logged into the member portal. I didn't just stop the payments. I selected the option to terminate the entire policy, effective at midnight tonight. If Julian bruised his knuckles the next time he decided to assault someone, he could pay for the ice pack out of his own empty pockets. The sheer volume of automatic payments I had set up over the years was staggering. I systematically worked my way down the list, cutting off every single financial lifeline. I canceled the auto pay for their high-end organic grocery delivery. I deleted the recurring payment for their purebred golden retriever's expensive customized diet. I even found the monthly subscription to the exclusive wine club Julian used to stock his impressive home bar and shut it down. With every click of the mouse, another layer of their fake wealth was stripped away. They thought they were living a luxury lifestyle built on Julian's tech success. But the reality was they were completely surviving on an allowance provided by the father they had just publicly humiliated. There was only one last connection to cut. I opened a new tab and logged into my cellular provider account. Decades ago, when Julian was just a teenager, I added his first cell phone to my family plan. As the years went on, that plan kept growing. Upgraded smartphones, unlimited data packages, international roaming for their lavish vacations. I was the primary account holder, and I paid that massive bill every single month. Just this afternoon, Chloe had used that exact phone, powered by the data plan I paid for, to record my humiliation. She was probably sending that video to her friends right now, laughing at the old man who just sat there and took it. I navigated to the device management page. 2 active lines appeared under my account, one for Julian, one for Chloe. I selected both devices. A drop-down menu appeared with options to pause data or temporarily suspend service. I ignored those and scrolled all the way to the bottom. I selected the option for permanent line cancellation. The system generated one final warning, stating that the phone numbers would be permanently lost and the devices would be immediately disconnected from the cellular network. I hit execution. I checked the digital clock on my laptop screen. It was 8:45 p.m. My mind pictured the scene back at the Thanksgiving party. The guests were probably talking under the string lights. Chloe would be holding her phone, getting ready to post a photo or send a text. Suddenly, the signal bars in the corner of her screen would drop to 0, and the network icon would vanish. She would try to refresh her browser, only to watch the screen load indefinitely. She would tap Julian on the shoulder, complaining about the terrible reception. Julian would pull out his own device, only to find his connection completely dead. Within 3 minutes, they would be totally isolated from the digital world. Unless they begged their neighbors for a Wi-Fi password, they wouldn't be able to make calls, send emails, or even log into their banking apps. I closed my laptop and pushed it away. The screen went dark, and the living room fell back into shadow. The entire process had taken less than 20 minutes. In that tiny window of time, I had completely dismantled the financial infrastructure of my son's life. He had no house, no car, no insurance, and no phone. At 8 p.m., he was a rich man. By 9 p.m., he had absolutely nothing. I got up from the couch and walked into the kitchen. I opened the high cabinet above the stove and pulled down a bottle of vintage bourbon I had been saving for a special occasion. I poured the deep amber liquid into a simple glass. No ice. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out at my quiet neighborhood. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty pavement. I took a slow sip of the bourbon. It went down smooth, a pleasant burn that warmed my chest. I ran my fingers over the throbbing bruises on my face and chest. The physical pain was still there, but the emotional weight that had suffocated me for years was completely gone. I didn't feel angry anymore, and I didn't feel sad. I felt an absolute, profound peace. The gears of financial execution had been set in motion, and nothing on earth could stop what was coming for them. I set my phone down on the counter. I opened the settings menu and switched the device to absolute silent mode. No vibration, no emergency alerts. I had zero interest in hearing the frantic voicemails they would inevitably leave once they finally found a working phone. I finished the last drop of bourbon and rinsed the glass in the sink. I turned off the kitchen light and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I pulled back the covers, climbed into bed, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 4 years, I slept through the entire night, waking up the next morning feeling truly alive. The rest of the weekend passed in the exact dead silence I had engineered. I didn't receive a single panic distress call, mostly because they didn't have a network connection to make one. I spent all of Sunday on the back porch reading a novel, listening to the birds, and enjoying the deep tranquility of a man who had finally dropped a massive burden. But when Monday morning arrived, the real-world consequences of my Friday night keystrokes began to bleed into the harsh light of day. By noon, Julian was right where he felt most powerful. He was sitting in a private leather booth at a top-tier Michelin-starred restaurant in San Francisco's financial district. This was his arena. He was entertaining 3 potential lead investors for his tech startup's high-stakes Series B funding round, the exact project he had ordered me to hand over my patents to secure. He ordered thousands of dollars worth of dry-aged Wagyu beef and multiple bottles of expensive imported red wine. He was talking smoothly, laughing loudly, doing everything he could to project the image of a highly successful young tech CEO who had the world on a string. He wanted these investors to believe he was a man of limitless resources, a safe bet for their capital. The lunch wrapped up, and the waiter brought the leather bill presenter to the table. The tab easily ran past $5,000. Julian didn't even look at the itemized receipt. With practiced fluidity, he slid his top-tier American Express black card out of his designer wallet and placed it on the silver tray with a confident smile. He leaned back and continued telling a story to his guests as the waiter walked away to process the payment. For years, Julian believed that credit card was proof of his own business worth. He thought the bank gave him that massive line of credit because they recognized his earning potential. The truth was far less flattering. When he first registered the business license for his startup, his credit was so toxic that banks refused to issue him any corporate cards. To spare him the embarrassment of having to confess to his partners, I quietly stepped in. I linked his corporate account to my own flawless personal financial portfolio, acting as a silent guarantor. My perfect credit score was the invisible armor protecting his fragile ego. But on Friday night, I had completely severed that guarantee. The armor was gone. The waiter returned to the table. He wasn't holding a receipt for Julian to sign. Instead, he leaned down and whispered with extreme discretion that the transaction had been declined. Julian scoffed. He confidently told the waiter to run it again, claiming their machine must be malfunctioning. The waiter politely explained that he had already tried 3 times, and the bank's system had flagged the card as invalid and frozen. The relaxed atmosphere at the table evaporated instantly. The potential investors stopped talking and stared directly at Julian. A hot, burning flush of embarrassment crawled up his neck. He reached into his pocket for his smartphone, intending to aggressively call the bank right in front of his guests to demand an explanation. He pulled out the device and stared at the screen. The signal indicator was completely empty. He had no service. He couldn't make a call, let alone access his banking app to transfer funds. He just sat there in a 5-star restaurant, facing a massive bill with 3 wealthy investors, watching his every move, holding nothing but a useless piece of plastic. He was forced to rise from the table with a bright red face, walk to the front reception desk, and humiliatingly beg to use their landline phone. At the exact same moment, Julian was experiencing his first public humiliation. 60 miles away in Napa Valley, Chloe was walking into a high-end wellness spa resort. She had booked an entire morning of luxury treatments, hot stone massages, organic facials, and a custom manicure. She spent 3 hours wrapped in a plush white bathrobe, sipping cucumber water, completely oblivious to the outside world. She truly believed she was living the life she was inherently entitled to. When the treatment ended, she went back to her private locker to change into her designer clothes. She pulled her phone out of her purse, intending to take a photo of her fresh manicure for social media. Just like Julian, she found her screen dead, completely disconnected from the network. Assuming the thick walls of the spa were blocking the cellular signal, she opened her settings menu and connected to the facility's complimentary Wi-Fi. The split second her phone established a connection to the internet, a flood of delayed notifications hit her screen, throwing the device into absolute chaos. It was a chain reaction of financial destruction. Red alert banners popped up one after another. Overdraft warnings on her personal checking account. Final notice demands from credit cards, and a repossession alert from the auto finance company. Her heart began to race. She quickly tapped on her primary banking app and logged in. The large balance number at the top of the screen, which usually brought her so much comfort, currently read negative several $100s. She frantically checked the transaction history, searching for the first of the month trust dividend. For years, on the first Monday of every single month, a substantial sum of money had magically appeared in her account. She and Julian treated it like a guaranteed inheritance, an automatic right. She had no idea that the so-called dividend was simply a manual transfer I initiated from my own retirement savings to ensure she never overdrew. This morning, for the first time in 5 years, that ghost money never arrived. Even more terrifying, a notification popped up from AWS stating that the core servers keeping Julian's tech company alive had just been completely shut down due to a failed corporate credit card. The startup's app was officially dead. Panic set in. She walked over to the elegant marble reception desk to check out. The receptionist smiled and swiped her debit card. The machine let out a sharp, piercing beep, flashing a declined message. Chloe nervously handed over a second credit card. Declined. She tried a third. Declined. The wealthy women waiting in line behind her started whispering, shifting uncomfortably. Chloe, the woman who loved to mock others for lacking status, was now the center of a humiliating spectacle. The spa manager was called over. Chloe was forced to leave her expensive diamond tennis bracelet behind at the front desk as collateral, just so they would let her walk out the door without calling the local police to arrest her for theft of services. But when she stepped outside, a worse nightmare was waiting. Her Rivian SUV, which she had parked in the VIP spot, had already been remotely locked down and towed away by the finance company. Back in downtown San Francisco, Julian finally reached the bank, using the restaurant's landline. A cold, automated voice informed him that his guarantor had cut ties, and due to a total lack of collateral, his accounts had been locked. He slammed the phone down. In that instant, he realized exactly what was happening. He remembered the blank, expressionless look on my face back in the wine cellar while he was slapping me 9 times. He realized the dead phones, the declined cards, and the vanished funds were all tied back to the old father he thought he could push around. He didn't go back to his clients. He couldn't face them. Leaving them at the table to handle a $5,000 bill was a coward's move that instantly destroyed his business deal and his professional reputation. He bolted out of the restaurant, jumped into his rented car, and tore onto the highway, speeding frantically toward the suburbs of Marin County. He was absolutely furious. He convinced himself this was just a petty temper tantrum on my part. All he could think about was kicking my door down, pointing a finger in my face, and forcing me to clean up the mess of his perfect Monday. He had absolutely no idea that the real nightmare hadn't even started yet. While my son was losing his mind on the highway, I was sitting in a sleek, glass-walled conference room on the 30th floor of a skyscraper in the heart of San Francisco's financial district. The low hum of the air conditioning created a cold, sterile environment that perfectly matched the business being handled. The room smelled of expensive leather and polished mahogany. Sitting to my right was my attorney, Thomas. He was a meticulous man who charged an absolute fortune, but he was worth every single penny. Sitting across the massive table was the cash buyer, the vulture capitalist. He was a commercial real estate developer whose entire business model revolved around hostile takeovers and flipping distressed assets. He didn't care about manicured lawns or custom infinity pools. He only cared about profit margins. He was a shark in a tailored charcoal suit, and I had just thrown him a bloody piece of meat. The developer's legal counsel sat beside him, reviewing the digital transfer files. They knew exactly what this was, a hostile corporate takeover. I had made it very clear during our initial phone call that the current occupants had no idea the property was being sold and would be extremely uncooperative. The developer didn't care. In fact, he thrived on it. He explained to me that his firm handled corporate lockouts every single week. They maintained their own tactical teams who specialized in clearing out stubborn tenants and securing high-value properties before any internal damage could be done. He looked over the property portfolio with greedy eyes, calculating exactly how much money he would make by tearing out that luxury kitchen and subdividing the massive commercial lot. Thomas opened a thick leather binder and pulled out a stack of legal documents. These weren't standard residential sales forms. They were commercial entity transfer agreements. By signing these, I wasn't just selling a house. I was transferring the entire holding company that owned the property, both the house and the commercial building, directly to the developer. It was a clean surgical strike that severed all my ties to that land. Thomas slid the crisp white papers across the polished wood table and handed me a heavy gold pen. He looked at me quietly for a brief moment, silently asking if I was absolutely certain about this irreversible decision. I didn't hesitate. I took the pen and smoothed out the paper. I signed my name on the first line. I thought about the first time I held Julian when he was a newborn. I signed the second line. I thought about the years of overtime I worked just to pay his tuition at Stanford. I signed the third line. I thought about the heavy blows raining down on my face in the wine cellar and Chloe's mocking laughter. With every stroke of the pen, I erased a piece of the past. I wasn't just selling real estate. I was evicting my son from my heart forever. I finished the final signature and pushed the paperwork back across the table. The developer smiled. He took the documents and handed them to his attorney, who quickly verified the signatures and stamped them with a notary seal. The heavy thud of the stamp in the quiet conference room sounded exactly like a guillotine dropping. The developer pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen, authorizing the wire transfer. My bank account was linked directly to the holding company. We sat in silence for 3 full minutes. Then my phone gave a soft vibration on the table. I glanced at the screen. A digital notification from my bank confirmed that a massive seven-figure sum had cleared and deposited into my account. The deal was done. The money was real and that house was legally gone. The developer didn't waste a single second. The moment the wire was confirmed, he placed a call to his head of logistics. I sat there and listened to him coordinate the immediate seizure of the property. He gave short, efficient commands. He ordered a heavy industrial dumpster to pull into the driveway within the hour. He dispatched a private security company made up of former special forces operators to lock down the perimeter of the estate. He instructed a team of commercial locksmiths to drill out every single deadbolt and install high-security digital keypads on all the exterior doors. He made it very clear to the security chief that since this was legally a commercial lease eviction, the former occupants had zero legal rights and were to be treated as hostile trespassers. If they resisted, the security team was authorized to call the local police immediately to hit them with criminal trespassing charges on private commercial property. The developer hung up and stood up from the table. He reached out to shake my hand, saying it was a pleasure doing business, and assured me his team would have the property completely locked down by late afternoon. I shook his hand. It was a firm, cold handshake between two men who understood the ruthless nature of business. Thomas began packing copies of the transfer papers into his briefcase. He asked if I needed a ride back to my truck. I told him I was fine. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the massive, sprawling city below. Somewhere down there, my son was racing through traffic, completely oblivious to the fact that his kingdom had just been conquered by a man in a charcoal suit. He was probably planning what he was going to scream at me when he finally tracked me down. He was probably practicing his angry demands and vicious insults, but he didn't have a single card left to play. His cards were plastic trash, his phone was a brick, and his precious tech startup was offline. And now the house he was driving back to was being surrounded by armed men who answered only to a corporate entity that couldn't care less about his feelings or his social status. The developer and his lawyer left the room, leaving just Thomas and me. Thomas closed his briefcase and told me that, from a legal standpoint, I was completely insulated. The LLC was gone, and the title was clean. There was absolutely nothing Julian could do to reverse the sale or claim any right to the assets. He was effectively a ghost, wandering through a house that belonged to total strangers. I thanked Thomas for his meticulous work. I left the high-rise and walked out into the warm afternoon sun. I decided to take a long, slow walk through a city park before heading home. I watched families having picnics and children playing on the grass. I felt a deep sense of relief wash over my entire body. The chains of obligation that had bound me to an abusive son were finally broken. I had spent my life building a safety net for a boy who only wanted to use it to strangle me. Now, the net was gone. He was in a free fall, and the ground was rushing up to meet him a lot faster than he realized. While I was enjoying that peaceful walk, Julian finally arrived at my house in Berkeley. I found out later from my neighbors that he threw an absolute tantrum on my front porch. He was sweating through his expensive shirt, screaming my name, and kicking the bottom of my front door. He was completely unhinged. He went around to the backyard, looking through the kitchen windows, trying to spot any sign of movement. He even tried to force open the sliding glass door, but I had placed a heavy wooden bar in the track, specifically to keep him out. He stood on my patio, surrounded by the dead silence of an empty house, completely unable to comprehend that his punching bag had vanished into thin air. He finally gave up, stormed back to his car, and tore down the street, driving back to his own suburban fortress. He thought he could retreat to his castle and regroup. He had no idea the castle was already being raided. The afternoon sun beat down on the suburban street, casting long shadows across the pristine asphalt. I wasn't there to witness the exact moment my son's kingdom collapsed, but the lead security contractor later provided Thomas with a highly detailed incident report alongside high-definition body cam footage of the entire confrontation. By 4 p.m., the tree-lined street of that exclusive neighborhood had turned into a theater of absolute humiliation. Julian turned the corner onto his block, driving like a madman, desperate for the security of his garage after his public shaming at the steakhouse. When he saw the chaos unfolding on his property, he slammed on the brakes, leaving black skid marks on the road. A taxi pulled up right behind him. Chloe stepped out of the back seat, disheveled and frantic, having been forced to leave her diamond bracelet at the spa just to pay for the ride home. They met on the sidewalk, staring dead on at the legally engineered nightmare I had built for them. The beautiful, custom-built cast-iron gates protecting the driveway were tightly wrapped in thick industrial steel chains and secured with a massive, solid brass padlock. Parked squarely on the paving stones blocking the entrance was a giant commercial roll-off dumpster. The air was thick with the rumble of diesel engines and the harsh, metallic grinding of heavy machinery. A crew of workers in bright yellow vests was aggressively tearing up the front lawn. The expensive, imported rose bushes Chloe loved to brag about to the neighbors were being ripped out by the roots and tossed carelessly into the rusted metal bin. Over at the side building, which served as the headquarters for his tech startup, workers were ruthlessly throwing rack servers and minimalist office desks straight into a shredding truck. The developer was wasting zero time, stripping the property down to its raw commercial value. Standing on the front porch blocking the heavy double doors were 3 private security contractors. These weren't neighborhood watch volunteers or local rent-a-cops. They were massive, muscular men built like brick walls, wearing dark tactical uniforms, heavy boots, and gear belts. They stood with their hands calmly clasped in front of them, completely indifferent to the destruction happening around them. They were paid a premium to stand right there and prevent any unauthorized person from setting foot on the developer's new asset. Julian completely broke down. His brain refused to accept the visual information in front of him, refused to accept the reality that his sanctuary was being dismantled. He charged up the driveway, his face turning a deep, dangerous purple. He bypassed the landscapers and marched straight toward the porch, waving his arms wildly. He demanded that these men leave his front door immediately, screaming that he was the legal homeowner and that they were committing a felony by trespassing on his land. The 3 men didn't budge an inch. They didn't even adjust their stance. When his demands were met with absolute silence, Julian escalated his threats. He puffed out his chest and screamed that there were guns inside the house. He swore he was going to break the chains, kick the door down, and shoot anyone who had invaded his property. For a man who had never experienced a real physical altercation in his entire life, it was a pathetic, desperate bluff. The lead security contractor, a thick-necked man with a completely blank expression, finally took a step forward. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a clean white clipboard holding a stack of legally binding documents. The contractor walked down the porch steps and stopped on the other side of the chained gate. Without raising his voice, he informed Julian in a flat, authoritative tone that threatening armed security on private commercial property was a fast track to federal prison. Then he slid the clipboard through a gap in the iron bars, instructing Julian to read the first page. Julian snatched the clipboard, his hands shaking violently from the adrenaline rushing through his veins. He stared at the paper. It was an immediate commercial eviction notice drafted and stamped by the county court. Attached right behind it was the deed transfer documentation I had signed in the downtown conference room just hours earlier. Julian read the name of the blind LLC that previously owned the house, Apex Holdings. He recognized the corporate address listed next to it. It was my home address. Then he read the name of the new owner, the Downtown Development Company. Chloe pushed past Julian, staring over his shoulder as her eyes scanned the legal jargon. The horrific truth finally hit them both like a tidal wave. My Kia. They had never owned this house. They had never held the title. The mortgage they thought they had been paying for the last 5 years was nothing more than a glorified commercial lease agreement. They were tenants living entirely at my mercy, and I had just terminated their lease. Chloe gasped, the realization sinking in that this house, The manicured lawn, the custom kitchen, and every ounce of social status tied to this address, even the startup's physical footprint, was an absolute illusion. The man she had mocked and filmed getting assaulted in the wine cellar secretly owned every single square inch of her perfect life. Julian dropped the clipboard onto the grass. The fake bravado drained completely from his body, leaving him hollow and trembling. He looked up at the contractor, trying to switch gears, begging for just a little more time. He begged them to call off the landscapers and let him make a few phone calls. He promised that if they just let him inside to access his computer and safe, he could clear up the misunderstanding. The contractor shook his head. He informed Julian that the land now belonged to the developer, and the demolition schedule was already set. However, the contractor explained that state law required them to allow the former occupants a brief window to retrieve essential personal items before the internal liquidation officially began. He reached over the gate and tossed two heavy black plastic trash bags onto the driveway at Julian's feet. The rules were simple and brutal. They had exactly 15 minutes to go inside. They could only take what could fit into those two bags. Everything else left in the house, the expensive furniture, the electronics, the designer clothing, would become the legal property of the development company to be sold or thrown into the dumpster. The contractor unlocked the heavy brass padlock, pulled the steel chains off the gate, and signaled for them to go in. Julian and Chloe grabbed the plastic bags and sprinted up the steps, their hearts pounding in pure panic. The three armed guards followed right behind them, monitoring their every single move to ensure they didn't try to vandalize the walls or steal any permanent fixtures. Those 15 minutes inside the house were a psychological torture of their own making. The massive interior space suddenly felt like a giant trap. They ran up the curved wooden staircase, slipping on the polished floors. Chloe rushed into her massive walk-in closet, completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of her belongings. She had racks of expensive dresses, dozens of pairs of imported shoes, and a wall of designer handbags. She grabbed a handful of clothes and shoved them into the black plastic bag, crying hysterically as she was forced to choose between an expensive winter coat and her favorite silk shirt. Julian ran into his home office, his arms sweeping across his desk. He shoved his laptop, his vital tax documents, and a few framed awards into his bag. He tried to grab a heavy bronze statue he had bought to impress clients, but the guard standing in the doorway firmly instructed him to put it down, stating that it was now a decorative asset belonging to the development firm. Julian was forced to drop the statue. He ran to the bedroom, dumping his expensive watches and whatever cash was hidden in his nightstand into the bottom of the plastic bag. The clock ticked down relentlessly. Every time they tried to pause and think, the lead contractor loudly announced the remaining time. 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 1 minute. They scrambled through their own home like panicked scavengers, desperately trying to salvage pieces of a life that no longer existed. When the 15 minutes were up, the contractor didn't give them a single second of grace. They ordered Julian and Chloe away from the dressers and toward the door. Chloe sobbed, begging to take just one more bag of shoes. The guards ignored her, physically placing themselves between her and the closet. They were marched down the grand staircase, carrying the black plastic trash bags over their shoulders like common vagrants. They stepped out the front door and onto the porch. The lead contractor pulled the heavy wooden doors shut. The sound of the deadbolts clicking into place echoed across the ruined front lawn. The guards escorted them down the driveway and past the iron gates. The steel chains were wrapped back around the iron bars, and the brass padlock snapped shut, locking them out forever. They stood on the public sidewalk with their trash bags, while the landscapers continued to toss the remaining rose bushes into the metal dumpster. They were completely locked out of the illusion they had built. Julian was a man who had never been told no by the universe. Even standing on a public sidewalk with his entire life shoved into two black plastic trash bags, his ego completely refused to accept the reality of the situation. He was convinced there was a loophole, an error, a manager he could just scream at to fix this massive problem. Since I had permanently cut off his cellular service, he couldn't use his own device to call for help. He grabbed Chloe by the arm, yanked her away from the lock gate, and dragged her down the manicured sidewalk toward the massive house next door. This house belonged to his cousin, a man who just 48 hours earlier had stood on the terrace with a beer, watching Julian slam his fist into my chest without saying a single word. Julian pounded his fist against his cousin's ornate glass front door, hitting it hard enough to shake the frame. When the door finally opened, he didn't ask for help. He demanded to come in. He forced his way into the grand foyer, pushing past his relatives who were looking at him with a mix of confusion and growing horror. He snatched the landline phone from the kitchen counter and dialed 911. He didn't tell the dispatcher he was involved in a commercial property dispute with a corporate landlord. He knew the police wouldn't rush out for a simple tenant issue. Instead, he fabricated an incredibly dangerous lie. He told the operator that heavily armed mercenaries had invaded his home, locked him out, and were currently holding his property hostage. He claimed his wife was terrified and that their lives were in extreme danger. He hung up the phone, feeling incredibly smug. He thought he had just gamed the system using the kind of ruthless, corporate mindset he prided himself on in Silicon Valley. He fully expected the police to show up, draw their weapons, and force the security contractors to hand over his keys. Less than 5 minutes later, the quiet suburban peace was violently shattered by the piercing wail of approaching sirens. 2 Marin County Sheriff's patrol cars rounded the corner at full speed, their red and blue emergency lights flashing against the pristine windows of the expensive homes. They slammed on their brakes, aggressively blocking the street. Right in front of the property's lock gates, 4 officers jumped out of their vehicles, moving with high-tension tactical precision. Their hands were pressed firmly against the sidearms in their holsters, and one officer unracked an AR-15 rifle, fully prepared to step into a violent, active hostage situation. Julian immediately rushed toward the officers, waving his arms and frantically pointing at the 3 security contractors who were standing perfectly calm on the porch. He put on quite a performance, playing the terrified, wealthy homeowner being maliciously targeted by corporate thugs. He demanded that the officers arrest these men for breaking and entering, armed robbery, and trespassing. The officers approached the gate with extreme caution, instructing everyone on the sidewalk to stay exactly where they were. The lead security contractor didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his radio or make any sudden aggressive movements. He calmly stated his name, his California state security license number, and his exact legal purpose on the property. Then he slowly reached his hand through the gap in the iron bars, handing the officers the exact same white clipboard he had shown Julian just minutes before. The senior officer took a step back, maintaining a safe tactical distance as he accepted the clipboard. He read through the immediate commercial eviction notice, drafted and stamped by the county court. He checked the signed deed transfer documents. He saw the official seals and the signatures of the downtown commercial developer. Instantly, the physical tension vanished from the officer's shoulders. He realized he hadn't walked into an armed robbery at all. He had walked into a routine corporate lockout. The officer turned away from the gate and walked right back over to Julian. He demanded to see a valid driver's license. Julian confidently pulled out his designer wallet and handed over his ID, eager to point out that his home address was printed right there on the plastic card. The officer nodded, confirming the address, and then asked one devastating legal question. He asked Julian to show him a single piece of paper, a recent mortgage statement, a property tax receipt, or a registered deed, proving that he actually owned the land beneath his feet. Julian stuttered. He tried to explain the complex financial arrangement they had been using for the past 5 years. He tried to explain that his father was the holding company, and that I had maliciously sold it just to punish him. The officer held up a hand, cutting off the wild, rambling explanation. He laid out the cold, hard reality of the law to a man who thought he was completely above it. An address printed on a driver's license proves residency. It does not prove ownership. The legally binding documents on the clipboard proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the LLC owned the house, and that company had just been legally sold to a new corporate entity. Furthermore, because this was a commercial turnkey master lease, California's regular tenant eviction delays didn't apply here at all. The officer's tone went from protective to completely rigid and uncompromising. He informed Julian that this was strictly a civil matter. The sheriff's department had absolutely zero jurisdiction to overturn a corporate property sale or enforce a verbal family rental agreement. Not only that, but the officer sternly warned Julian about the severe criminal consequences of what he had just done. He told him that calling emergency services and fabricating a story about armed mercenaries just to manipulate a rapid police response was a stunt known as swatting, and it was a serious federal crime. Julian tried to argue using the exact same aggressive boardroom tactics he was used to. He raised his voice, insisting his civil rights were being violated and demanding to speak with the sheriff immediately. He was still desperately trying to bully his way out of a situation where he held zero legal cards. The senior officer had absolutely no patience for a spoiled Silicon Valley executive throwing a toddler tantrum on a public street. He unclipped his radio, stepped directly into Julian's personal space, and towered over him. The officer delivered a final, non-negotiable ultimatum. He pointed his finger toward the end of the block. He told Julian he had exactly 10 seconds to pick up his trash bags and get off the property line. If he set 1 foot back on that lawn, or if he continued to cause a public disturbance, the officer promised to arrest him on the spot for criminal trespassing and filing a false police report. The officer placed his hand firmly on the steel handcuffs, resting on his heavy leather belt, making it crystal clear that this was not a negotiation, but a direct legal order. The overwhelming reality of that physical threat finally punctured Julian's thick armor of arrogance. He looked at the officers standing dead-eyed against him. He looked at the heavy steel chains locking the massive iron gates. And then he looked around at the neighboring houses. The street was dead silent, but the wide windows weren't empty. The heavy drapes of the surrounding homes were parted just a crack, revealing the faces of our extended family. The aunts, the cousins, the nephews, the exact same crowd that had happily eaten the turkey I paid for, drank his premium alcohol, and watched him pin me against a wine rack and slap me silly without lifting a single finger to stop it. They were all watching him now. They watched the golden boy of the family, the successful business genius, get ran off by the local police like a common criminal. They watched his beautiful wife standing on a concrete sidewalk with ruined makeup running down her cheeks. Not a single front door opened to offer them shelter. Not a single relative stepped out to offer a glass of water, a ride to a hotel, or a place to sleep tonight. They stayed safely behind their glass windows, silently witnessing the spectacular public collapse of his fake empire. They chose his side when he was powerful, and the moment he was weak, they abandoned him without a second thought. Julian swallowed hard. His face went completely pale, his hands shaking violently as the adrenaline drained from his body. He bent down and picked up the heavy black trash bag filled with his laptops and his broken pride. Chloe silently picked up her bag of wrinkled designer clothes, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Without another word, they turned their backs on the massive mansion they thought they owned. They began the long, deeply humiliating walk down the wealthy suburban street, dragging their plastic bags along the rough concrete pavement. They were completely exposed, utterly defenseless, and entirely alone. And the most beautiful part of it all was that this devastating moment was entirely of their own making. But the humiliation on the suburban sidewalk was only the opening chapter of their nightmare. After the police ordered them to leave, my son and his wife dragged their heavy black trash bags down the street until they reached a commercial avenue. They didn't have working cell phones to call an Uber. They didn't have active credit cards to book a luxury suite downtown. They were forced to walk 2 miles in the fading sunset, the handles of the cheap plastic bags stretching and tearing under the weight of the items they had salvaged. Designer shoes and expensive laptops scraped against the hot asphalt. They finally ended up at a run-down roadside motel, right off Highway 101. It was the kind of place that catered to transient crowds and hourly rentals. The neon sign out front buzzed loudly, with half of its letters completely burned out. Julian had to walk into the dim lobby, which smelled of stale beer and desperation, empty his pockets, and use the last few crumpled bills he had grabbed from his nightstand just to pay for a single night. The room smelled of old cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach. The carpet was stained with unknown substances, and the thin mattress sagged deeply in the middle. For a couple that had spent the last 5 years sleeping on imported Egyptian cotton sheets and washing off in a custom marble shower, this filthy box was a psychological prison. The shock of the public eviction finally faded, and the adrenaline was instantly replaced by a toxic, suffocating panic. The tiny room became a pressure cooker. Julian had no space to pace. There was no grand terrace to project his fake authority. There was only a stained armchair, a flickering TV, and a mirror reflecting the pathetic reality of his situation. The marriage fractured instantly. A relationship built entirely on the foundation of my stolen wealth couldn't survive even a single hour of actual hardship. Julian needed a scapegoat. His massive ego simply could not process the fact that his own arrogant actions had caused this absolute ruin. He turned the entirety of his rage onto his wife. Standing in the middle of that dingy room, he frantically accused Chloe of causing everything. He screamed that her endless shopping sprees, her obsession with country club status, and her constant need to show off for her wealthy friends had completely drained his bank accounts. He blamed her for being a selfish parasite who ruined his pristine financial standing. He completely ignored his own horrific credit history, his failed investments, and his own lavish spending habits. He desperately needed her to take the fall, so he could remain the perfect victim in his own twisted mind. He pointed a finger right in her face, using the exact same gesture he had used to jab my chest just hours earlier. He demanded to know where the money went, shouting that if she hadn't spent so much on high fashion, luxury vacations, and weekly spa treatments, they would have enough cash right now to hire a high-powered attorney to fight the corporate lockout. He backed her up against the peeling wallpaper of the motel room, hurling insults and belittling her just like he had done to me. But Chloe was not a grieving father willing to sit there and silently take his abuse. Chloe was a cornered animal, and she had claws of her own. She snapped. She pushed him away hard with both hands, screaming right back into his face, her voice tearing through the paper-thin walls of the motel. She told him he was a complete failure as a provider and a massive fraud as a husband. She reminded him that he was the one who insisted on expensive Michelin dinners and imported whiskey just to look important in his Silicon Valley circles. And then the sheer pressure of the situation forced a devastating truth to the surface. She screamed out a confession that left Julian completely paralyzed. She admitted that 6 months ago their finances were already secretly collapsing. Julian's new business venture was burning cash at an alarming rate, and his corporate salary wasn't even close to sustaining their wealthy facade. Instead of cutting back and living within their means, Chloe had taken matters into her own hands. She admitted that behind his back she had taken out a massive, off-the-books bridge loan to keep their lifestyle afloat. She borrowed $1.5 million in cold, hard cash. But she didn't go to a bank or a legitimate lending institution because their credit was completely shot. She went to one of those unregulated offshore financial syndicates in San Francisco, the kind run by shadowy financiers with connections to Macau, operating entirely in the dark and charging astronomical weekly interest. The kind of people who don't send polite warning letters when you miss a payment. Julian froze, staring at his wife in pure horror. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a creeping dread. He stuttered, asking her what on earth she could have possibly used to secure that much unregulated money. Chloe let out a bitter, hysterical laugh, wiping away the ruined makeup on her cheeks. She told him she used the only high-value asset they had. She used the house. She had forged the necessary corporate paperwork and utility bills to prove to the private lenders that they held clean ownership of the premium hillside property. The lenders accepted the estate as ironclad collateral for the $1.5 million, fully believing that if the couple defaulted, they could legally place a lien on the property and take it by force. The terrifying reality of the situation hit Julian like a freight train. That house was no longer just their sanctuary. It was the only barrier between them and some incredibly dangerous people. And now, the house was gone. The collateral had vanished into thin air, legally and permanently transferred to a commercial developer with an army of corporate lawyers and armed guards. The $1.5 million loan was completely unsecured. Julian staggered backward, sitting down heavily on the edge of the stained mattress, kicking up a cloud of dust. His breathing became incredibly fast and shallow. He knew exactly what this meant. Chloe had missed this month's payment because I cut off the invisible trust dividend she relied on. The lenders were already actively looking for their money. They would go to the suburban mansion first, only to find a locked steel gate and a commercial demolition crew. They would quickly realize the collateral was a total sham and that they had been openly defrauded. When aggressive, unregulated lenders realize they've been ripped off, they don't file a lawsuit in civil court. They look for immediate physical retaliation. Chloe stood in the corner of the room crying uncontrollably, but she delivered one final fatal blow to Julian's fragile reality. She took a deep breath and told him that before handing over the briefcase full of cash, the lenders demanded verified emergency contacts and a place of work. She had given them the exact address of Julian's tech startup co-working space. She gave them his floor, his specific desk location, and his personal extension. The people holding $1.5 million worth of violent hatred knew exactly where he went every single day. They knew his routine. They knew exactly where to find him when the sun came up tomorrow. My son sat in that filthy motel room, completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had no phone to call the police for protection. He had no money to buy a plane ticket and flee the city. He had no safe house to hide in. He was completely exposed to the elements of his own arrogance. He realized that tomorrow morning he couldn't just walk away, because his entire identity and his last hope of generating income were tied to his CEO title and his remaining investor connections. But walking into that office building meant walking directly into the jaws of ruthless debt collectors. I learned all of these precise details later from the report, compiled by the private investigator Thomas hired to monitor the fallout. Reading the transcript of their motel fight didn't bring me any joy, but it brought a profound sense of justice. Julian had spent his entire adult life playing the smartest guy in the room, using me as a disposable stepping stone. He thought he could abuse me with zero consequences just because I was his father. But he forgot that a father is also the only person who knows exactly how fragile his son really is. He was about to learn that the real world doesn't care about his executive title or his expensive suits. The real world demands payment, and my son was completely bankrupt. Tuesday morning arrived with the cruel indifference of a rising sun. Julian had spent the entire night staring at the water stains on the ceiling of that roadside motel. He hadn't slept a single minute. His expensive custom suit was wrinkled and reeked of the stale cigarette smoke that filled the cheap room. He had no clean shirt to change into and no hot water for a proper shave. But he forced himself up from the sagging bed and drove out to an exclusive private club in San Francisco, the Battery. With his tech startup's garage headquarters being dismantled, his only hope was to meet his final few angel investors or board members at this highly exclusive club. It was the last remaining piece of his fake identity. He walked into the club's marble lobby, desperately trying to project his usual vibe of arrogant success. He sat on a leather couch, believing that if he could just pitch his way into one massive, life-saving injection of capital, he could generate enough commission to start climbing out of the grave I dug for him. He had absolutely no idea that the sharks had already swum into the building. Across the pristine foyer of the club, two men walked through the revolving glass doors. They did not belong in this environment of high finance and polished luxury. They wore cheap, ill-fitting suits that hung loosely off their massive frames. Under the bright lobby lights, the fabric looked cheap and reflective. Thick black ink crept up from beneath their shirt collars, extending up the sides of their thick necks. They walked with heavy, deliberate strides, looking exactly like men who made a living through physical intimidation. The young receptionist sitting behind the mahogany desk sensed the danger immediately. She stood up and politely asked them to sign the visitor log and state their business. The two men didn't even look at her. Completely ignoring her polite requests, they marched straight toward the member-only area. When an unsuspecting senior analyst swiped his card to open the glass security turnstile, the two men grabbed the heavy glass barrier and forced their way in right behind him. The receptionist frantically picked up the phone to call building security, but the men were already down the hall. Inside the lounge area, the atmosphere was quiet and high productivity. Dozens of executives and founders sat in modern leather chairs, speaking in hushed tones to wealthy clients. Julian was sitting in the corner, sweating profusely into his phone as he pleaded with a client, trying to salvage a business relationship he had ruined at the steakhouse the day before. He didn't see the lounge doors push open. He didn't see the two massive men step onto the plush carpet of the lounge. The men didn't wander around aimlessly. Chloe had provided incredibly detailed directions to secure the loan. They walked directly toward the corner where Julian was sitting. The sudden intrusion broke the low hum of the lounge. The heavy footsteps of the two men drew the attention of every executive they passed. They stopped directly in front of Julian. Julian looked up from his laptop screen, his eyes widening in pure terror. He recognized what kind of men they were instantly. The lead collector, a man with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, reached out and snatched the phone right out of Julian's hand. Instead of hanging it up, he threw it onto the floor, leaving the potential client on the other end with a deadline. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but the man slammed his heavy hands flat onto the glass tabletop in front of Julian, creating a loud smack that sounded like a gunshot echoing through the entire lounge. Every conversation in the room stopped instantly. Dozens of heads turned toward Julian. The lead collector didn't care about the etiquette of a high-end club. He didn't care about keeping his voice down. He spoke in a loud, booming volume, ensuring that every single person within 100 feet could hear exactly what he was saying. He looked down at Julian and read out his full name. Then he announced to the entire room that Julian and his wife, Chloe, had openly defrauded his organization. He stated the exact amount of the debt, crisp and clear, $1.5 million. He told Julian that the fake deeds and forged property documents they used to secure the cash had been discovered. He explained that the suburban house was gone, and the loan was now completely unsecured. Julian was completely paralyzed. The color drained from his face, turning a sickly dead gray. He looked around in absolute terror, catching the shocked faces of his peers, his competitors, and his remaining investors. He tried to stand up. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, whispering frantically, begging the two men to lower their voices. He pleaded with them to step down the hall into a private glass conference room so they could quietly discuss a repayment schedule. The second man, covered in tattoos, let out a harsh, cruel sneer. He stepped around the table, invading Julian's personal space. He grabbed the lapels of Julian's wrinkled suit jacket and slammed him hard back into his chair. The lead collector leaned over the table, bringing his scarred face just inches away from my son. He told Julian there would be no private meetings and no restructured repayment schedules. He laid out the absolute final terms of their arrangement with chilling precision. He told Julian he had exactly 3 days. By Friday afternoon at 5 p.m. sharp, a wire transfer for the full $1.5 million, plus an additional $200,000 in penalty interest, had to clear in their offshore account. If that money wasn't sitting in their bank on the dot, they wouldn't come looking for him at this club. They would find him wherever he slept. The man loudly and vividly described exactly what they would do to him. He made an open promise of extreme physical violence, threatening to shatter both of his kneecaps with a heavy steel pipe to ensure he would never walk into a corporate boardroom ever again. The threat was no empty bluff. It was a guaranteed commitment to violence delivered in front of over 50 witnesses. The heavy glass doors of the lounge were finally pushed open. 3 uniformed club security guards rushed into the room, running down the main aisle. Their hands were on their defensive gear, shouting for the 2 men to step away from the table immediately. The collectors didn't resist. They didn't try to fight the security guards. They had already achieved their primary goal. They had completely destroyed Julian's safe space, humiliated him in front of his peers, and delivered their violent ultimatum. The lead collector let go of the table and straightened his cheap suit jacket. He flashed a terrifying, predatory smile at Julian, tapped his heavy watch to signal the ticking clock, and turned around. The 2 men willingly cooperated as security escorted them off the floor, laughing out loud as they walked toward the elevators. The silence they left behind was absolutely deafening. The security guards vanished down the hallway, leaving Julian alone in his chair. He was shaking so violently he couldn't even pick up his phone receiver from the floor. He slowly raised his eyes and saw the true extent of the damage. Every single member in the room was staring at him, but worse than the stares of his peers was the sight standing at the far end of the room. Several core board members and venture capital, leads from Julian's startup, had just walked out of an informal meeting. They had witnessed the entire confrontation. They had heard the numbers of the massive debt. They had heard the allegations of forgery and fraud. And they had heard the violent threats from men who clearly belonged to a dangerous syndicate. Julian realized in that excruciating moment that his professional mask was permanently shattered. The golden boy image he had spent years cultivating with my money was completely dead. He wasn't a rising tech star anymore. He was a massive liability, a walking disaster zone connected to violent criminals and unregulated debt. The lead investor didn't walk over to ask if he was okay. He just gave Julian a look of absolute disgust, turned on his heel, and walked straight out of the club. Julian sat frozen in his chair, completely ruined, knowing that his absolute worst moment of the day was only just beginning. The silence that settled over the lounge after the collectors left wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a suffocating, tomb-like stillness. Within 2 minutes, the club management walked over and bluntly asked him to leave immediately, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. The exact second he stepped through the club's exit doors, his phone automatically connected to a public Wi-Fi network. The notification chimes for incoming emails began to go off like crazy. The board had already held an emergency meeting. The first email detailed his immediate termination as CEO. The second stripped him of all his unvested company stock options. The third was the most devastating. Due to a severe breach of moral clauses and suspected misappropriation of funds, the board had officially launched a comprehensive forensic audit of his expense reports for the past 3 years. Every single client dinner, every premium flight, every luxury hotel stay, every single penny he had billed to the company was going to be aggressively scrutinized by corporate fraud investigators. The email ended with a terrifying warning. If the auditors found even a single dollar of misused company funds or inflated personal expenses, they wouldn't handle it internally. They would package the evidence and hand it directly over to the SEC and the district attorney to prosecute him for felony fraud. Julian felt the entire world spinning around him. For years, he had treated the company expense account like a personal slush fund, casually using lavish lunches and expensive drinks to sustain his wealthy illusion. He knew exactly what the auditors were going to find. He realized that losing his title was no longer his biggest problem. His own carelessness and vanity had pushed him directly into the crosshairs of federal prison. He stood on the bustling streets of San Francisco, the afternoon sun beating down on his shoulders, surrounded by thousands of professionals hurrying back to their secure jobs. And he had nowhere to go, because his reputation was entirely trashed, and his record would soon be flagged for internal fraud. He would never be able to find a job in tech or finance ever again. He was completely broke. He had no house to go back to, and the countdown clock set by violent debt collectors was still ticking away. He had 3 days to come up with $1.7 million, or his life would end in unimaginable physical agony. He stood on the street corner, completely unemployable, utterly bankrupt, and deeply alone. The invisible landlord he had spent years abusing had taken away his shelter and his livelihood, without ever throwing a single punch. The Tuesday sun went down, leaving my son in absolute darkness, both literally and figuratively. He spent the entire night sitting on a park bench because he couldn't bear the thought of going back to that filthy motel room to face his furious wife. The ticking clock set by the collectors throbbed inside his skull with every single heartbeat. He was backed entirely into a corner. As the night grew deeper, the pure fear of physical pain began to warp his mind. He fell into a state of absolute criminal desperation. His massive ego completely took over his reasoning, rewriting the narrative to justify the unthinkable. He convinced himself that I was the villain in his story. He rationalized that my patents and my wealth rightfully belonged to him, and that I was maliciously withholding the funds that could save his life. He decided he wasn't going to ask anymore. He was going to take it by force. He came up with a reckless plan driven by panic and entitlement. He knew I kept my vital financial documents, physical patent titles, and emergency checkbooks in the heavy steel safe in my Berkeley home office. He believed that if he could just get into my house, he could take physical control of me. He planned to wake me up in the middle of the night, use the sheer force of his rage to intimidate me, and force me to sign the transfer papers and log into my banking portals to initiate an immediate wire. He was fully prepared to cross the ultimate line from an abusive son to a violent home invader. At 2 a.m., the suburban streets of my neighborhood were completely empty. The only sound was the low buzz of the streetlights, casting pools of dull yellow light onto the empty asphalt. Julian drove onto my block, but he didn't pull into my driveway. He parked 3 streets away, hiding his car in the shadow of a large oak tree. He sat in the dark for a few minutes, building up his courage, then stepped out of the vehicle and began walking toward the house he grew up in. He kept his head down, staying clear of the streetlights, moving like a thief in the night. He reached the edge of my property and slipped quietly through the side gate. He walked into the backyard, stepping carefully onto the grass to avoid making any sound, and approached the back of the house. All the windows were completely dark. He pressed his face against the glass of the kitchen door to peer inside, but the heavy curtains were drawn tight. He reached out to pull the handle of the sliding patio door, but it didn't budge. Julian realized he couldn't simply pick the lock or force the door open. He needed to break the perimeter. He walked to the edge of the patio and picked up a heavy decorative landscaping brick from the flower bed. He stepped over to a small window belonging to the laundry room at the back corner of the house. Wrapping his suit jacket tightly around his hand to muffle the sound, he slammed the heavy brick directly into the center of the glass pane. The glass shattered inward with an incredibly sharp, terrifying crash that sounded deafening in the dead of night. Julian froze, pressing his back flat against the brick wall of the house, waiting to see if an alarm would trip or if the lights would suddenly flash on. The neighborhood remained dead silent. He reached his hand through the jagged hole in the window, fumbling for the internal latch. A sharp shard of glass cut deeply into his palm. He gasped from the pain, pulling his hand back to see dark red blood welling up under the moonlight. Wiping the blood on his pants, he ignored the stinging pain, reached back inside, undid the latch, and pushed the window open. He climbed clumsily through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the linoleum floor of the laundry room. He lay there panting heavily, his heart racing from the massive adrenaline rush of committing a major felony. He stood up, brushing glass shards off his clothes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a loaded ghost gun, an unregistered firearm he had bought on the black market years ago out of a weird Silicon Valley doomsday obsession. Tonight, he was holding it with malicious intent, fully prepared to point it at his own father. He stepped out of the laundry room and entered the main hallway. He expected to hear the sound of my breathing or the creak of wooden floorboards as I got out of bed to investigate the noise. But he heard absolutely nothing. He pulled out his smartphone, using the screen as a dim flashlight to guide his way. Holding the gun tightly, he walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom. He reached out and pushed the door open, ready to scream out his demands. He swept the dim light across the room and stopped dead in his tracks. The bedroom was completely bare. There was no bed, there was no dresser. The heavy oak nightstands were gone. The closet doors were wide open, revealing completely empty shelves. He spun around, utterly confused. He ran back into the hallway, rushing toward the home office. He kicked the door open. The heavy steel safe was gone. The massive mahogany desk was gone. The bookshelves were wiped completely clean. Panic began to rise in his chest, replacing the violent adrenaline. He ran into the living room, the largest space in the house, and swept his phone light across the floor. The sofa, the TV, the coffee table, the rugs, every single thing had been completely cleared out. The house was nothing but an empty, echoing shell. When I finalized the sale of his house with the commercial developer, I also realized my own physical safety was completely exposed. I knew exactly how my son would react when he didn't get what he wanted. I immediately hired a premium moving company to pack up my entire life on Monday morning. By Monday evening, I had completely moved out, relocating to a highly secure temporary residence that Julian knew absolutely nothing about. Julian stood in the center of the empty living room, listening to the sound of his own heavy breathing echoing off the bare walls. He realized I was gone, and his massive, violent plan had completely vanished into thin air. And then the dim beam of his phone light caught something sitting right in the exact center of the room. It was a single metal folding chair, the exact same kind of cheap folding chair I had been sitting on when he assaulted me at his Thanksgiving barbecue. Utterly baffled, he walked slowly toward the chair. As he got closer, he noticed a tiny detail in the upper corner of the room, facing the chair directly. It was a high-definition security camera mounted firmly to the wall. Right in the center of the black lens, a tiny red light was steadily blinking. Julian stared dead at that blinking red light, and a sickening reality washed over him like a bucket of ice water. The house wasn't just empty. It was a trap. I had anticipated his exact level of desperation. I knew he would come looking for money. Before leaving, I instructed Thomas to install this state-of-the-art night vision camera system. The camera wasn't recording to a local hard drive that Julian could easily smash. It was connected to an independent cellular router, broadcasting high-definition video and audio in real time to an encrypted legal server at Thomas's downtown law firm. Julian looked down at his hands. He was standing inside a house he had just broken into. His hand, sliced by the shattered window glass, was bleeding heavily, leaving physical DNA evidence right at the point of entry. He was holding a deadly, unregistered firearm, showing clear, premeditated intent of violence, and he was staring directly into a camera lens that was currently broadcasting his felony burglary and armed home invasion to a server he could never touch. He had walked directly into the jaws of a legal bear trap, and the heavy steel teeth had just snapped tightly around his ankle. His hand went limp, and the gun dropped to the hardwood floor, the heavy metal making a loud clang in the empty room. He dropped to his knees in the dark, finally understanding that he was completely, utterly defeated. Julian remained on his knees on the bare hardwood floor of my former living room, completely mesmerized by the tiny, blinking red light on the security camera. What he didn't know was that the exact second the laundry room window shattered, a highly sophisticated silent alarm had been triggered instantly. I hadn't relied on a standard cheap alarm system that just blared a siren to scare off teenagers. I instructed Thomas to hire a top-tier private security monitoring firm. The moment the glass broke, a live high-definition feed of the interior layout was broadcast directly to a dedicated dispatcher inside a secure facility miles away. The dispatcher saw a bleeding man with a gun climbing through a broken window and immediately contacted the Berkeley Police Department, reporting a verified armed burglary in progress. Because the break-in was confirmed via live video feed, the police response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The officers did not turn on their sirens. They didn't want to alert the intruder and trigger a dangerous hostage situation or a frantic foot chase through a dark neighborhood. 4 separate patrol cars glided onto the block with their headlights completely turned off. Moving like silent metal predators, they pulled up to the edge of my property line. Heavily armed officers stepped out of their vehicles, clicking the doors shut quietly to avoid any metallic sound. They deployed rapidly, establishing a tactical perimeter that completely locked down the entire house. They covered the backyard, the side gates, and the front driveway, cutting off every single possible escape route. Julian was locked inside a heavily guarded box, and he had absolutely no idea. Inside the empty house, the adrenaline that had just drained from Julian's body came roaring back into his veins, turning into pure, unfiltered panic. He realized he had to get out of there immediately, before anyone could look at that camera footage. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the bare hardwood floors. In his blind haste, he bent down and snatched up the deadly weapon he had dropped minutes earlier, shoving it deep into his suit jacket pocket. He thought he was just taking his own property. He had no idea he was actively holding on to the exact piece of physical evidence that would guarantee him a very long prison sentence. He ran back into the hallway, panting heavily, looking desperately for a way out. He thought about going back through the laundry room window, but the jagged glass was covered in his own blood, and climbing out headfirst would be slow and incredibly risky. He ran into the kitchen and grabbed the handle of the sliding patio door, but the thick wooden bar I had wedged into the track didn't budge an inch. He was like a rat trapped in a maze of his own making. The only possible exit left was the heavy front door. He sprinted down the main hallway, his footsteps echoing loudly against the bare walls. He reached the foyer and grabbed the brass doorknob of the front door. He stupidly believed that if he could just get outside and disappear into the shadows, he could run those 3 blocks back to his car and escape into the night. He pulled open the heavy wooden door and stepped out onto the front porch. The absolute darkness of the quiet suburban night was instantly shattered into a million pieces. The exact millisecond his foot hit the concrete steps, 4 massive police spotlights slammed on all at once. They were mounted on the patrol cars parked at the end of the driveway, and the intense glare blinded him instantly. The blinding white light washed over his wrinkled suit and his bleeding hand, illuminating his crime for the entire world to see. Before his eyes could even adjust, a chorus of deep, authoritative voices ripped through the silence of the block. 3 officers stood directly at the bottom of the porch steps, their service weapons drawn and aimed right at the center of his chest. Bright red laser sights painted glowing red dots across his white dress shirt. The lead officer roared for Julian to get his hands up and step away from the door. Julian was completely paralyzed by the sudden, blinding ambush. He had lived his entire life inside a perfect bubble of Silicon Valley corporate privilege, where conflicts were handled through angry emails and passive-aggressive boardroom meetings. He had never faced the terrifying reality of lethal force. He dropped instantly to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, raising his bleeding hands high above his head. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to argue. And he didn't demand to speak to the sheriff like he had done at his former estate that afternoon. The raw terror stripped away every ounce of his arrogant facade. He wept like a terrified child, begging the officers not to shoot him. 2 officers rushed up the concrete steps, grabbed his arms, and violently forced him down onto his stomach. They slammed his face hard against the rough concrete of the porch, scraping his cheek. One officer drove a heavy knee between his shoulder blades, pinning him securely to the ground, while the other forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists, locking his hands together. They yanked him roughly to his feet, completely ignoring his whimpers of pain. They marched him down the driveway and slammed him hard against the warm metal hood of a patrol car. The senior officer began a thorough pat-down search incident to the felony arrest. He patted down Julian's legs and torso, checking for hidden weapons or stolen property. The officer slid his gloved hand into the right pocket of Julian's suit jacket. His fingers closed around a heavy, cold piece of metal. The officer pulled his hand out, holding the unregistered ghost gun up under the bright glare of the spotlights. The entire atmosphere among the officers on scene shifted instantly from a standard property crime response to an extreme, high-threat level. The senior officer looked at Julian with pure disgust. He informed my son that breaking a window to enter an empty house was a standard burglary charge, but committing a home invasion while carrying a deadly firearm completely changed the legal nature of the crime. The officer told Julian flat out that carrying a loaded, unregistered gun showed a clear, premeditated intent to cause severe bodily harm or death to the occupants of the home. The criminal charges were upgraded right then and there. He was no longer just being arrested for breaking and entering or property damage. He was now facing violent felony charges, including armed burglary and possession of a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. Julian pressed his bruised face against the metal hood of the police car, crying uncontrollably as the officer read off the catastrophic list of charges. The $1.5 million in unregulated debt, his ruined corporate career, and the lost hillside mansion suddenly became the least of his problems. He was going straight to a high-security county jail. Because he was charged with a violent armed felony, there was absolutely zero chance of a quick bail or finding a sympathetic judge. He had walked into the dark hoping to use violence to steal his financial salvation, and instead he had walked directly into the absolute end of his life as a free man. The next morning, I watched the entire event unfold in an encrypted video file Thomas sent to my new laptop, and I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. Wednesday morning brought a crisp breeze through San Francisco's financial district. I had just wrapped up my final meeting with Thomas, finalizing the irrevocable trust documents that would permanently protect the rest of my assets. I walked out of his high-rise office building feeling a profound sense of closure. Across the street sat a quiet, upscale European cafe, a Blue Bottle. I decided to treat myself to a simple black coffee and a moment of reflection before heading back to my new secure residence. I took a seat at a small marble table near the front window, watching the city move through the glass. The anxiety that used to control my daily routine was completely gone. I wasn't waiting for my son's next financial disaster to hit anymore. He was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell, waiting for a bail hearing that would never come. My peaceful moment was violently interrupted exactly 12 minutes later. The heavy glass door of the cafe was flung open so hard it slammed against the brass doorstop. The bell above the frame jingled frantically. I looked up from my cup. Standing in the entrance was Chloe. The transformation she had gone through over the last 48 hours was shocking. The woman who had been gliding across her custom terrace in a designer gown just 3 days ago was completely gone. Her expensive blonde hair was tangled into a matted mess. She was wearing the exact same wrinkled clothes she had shoved into a trash bag during the corporate eviction. Her face was pale, completely stripped of the expensive makeup she usually used to face the world. She looked around the room frantically, her eyes darting from table to table until they finally locked onto me. Apparently, she had gone to Thomas's office demanding to know where I was, and one of the paralegals must have pointed her toward this cafe. She practically sprinted across the polished wood floor. The low hum of conversation from the wealthy customers and the soft jazz playing through the speakers died instantly. Dozens of people turned their heads, watching this near hysterical woman charge toward a quiet elderly man. She didn't pull out a chair. She didn't try to have a civilized conversation. The moment she reached my table, her knees completely buckled. She collapsed directly onto the hard floor, slamming her hands onto the edge of my marble table as she gasped for air. She began to sob hysterically. It wasn't a quiet, dignified cry. It was a massive, visceral wail that echoed off the high ceilings of the cafe. The barista behind the counter froze, still holding a steaming pitcher of milk. The businessmen at the next table lowered their newspapers. Chloe didn't care about the public scene at all. She was completely consumed by pure survival instinct. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and begged me to save her life. She told me Julian had been arrested in the middle of the night, and that he was facing many years in a maximum security prison. She screamed that the private lenders, the people holding the $1.5 million in unsecured debt, knew exactly who she was. She told me they had already found that filthy roadside motel. She had barely managed to escape through the back door when they started pounding on the frame early this morning. She was completely isolated, utterly bankrupt, and being hunted by violent people who wanted their money right now. She clamped her hands tightly around mine, her fingernails digging deep into my skin, begging me to make a wire transfer. She swore that if I just paid off the syndicate, she would disappear forever and never ask me for another dime. When the begging failed to get any immediate emotional reaction out of me, she shifted her tactics. She tried to play the ultimate victim card. She glanced around at the stunned customers, trying to solicit their sympathy before looking back into my eyes. Dropping her voice to a desperate whisper, she claimed she was never the enemy. Without a single second of hesitation, she threw her own husband completely under the bus. She told me she had always been terrified of Julian. She claimed he was emotionally unstable, and that he had forced her to take out that shadow loan to fund his failing business. She painted herself as a helpless hostage, trapped in a toxic marriage, forced to cooperate with his cruel treatment of me just to survive his temper. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, hoping my paternal instincts would override my logic, hoping I would see her as a frightened daughter who needed a savior. I sat perfectly still, letting her finish her carefully orchestrated performance. I gently pulled my hands away from her desperate grip. I reached for my porcelain cup and took a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was bitter and hot, providing a perfect sense of grounding. I set the cup back down on the saucer, letting the ceramic make a soft chime in the quiet room. I looked down at the woman kneeling in front of me. I didn't feel a single ounce of anger. All I felt was a cold, absolute clarity. I spoke to her in a quiet, incredibly soft voice, so soft that she had to stop sobbing just to hear me. I completely ignored her made-up story about being a helpless victim. Instead, I took her right back to that Thanksgiving wine cellar. I painted the picture for her using precise words. I reminded her of the low, steady hum of the climate control system. I reminded her of the sour smell of the broken wine bottle filling the air. I reminded her of the exact moment Julian crowded into my personal space and started throwing those violent slaps. As I laid out the events, I watched the color drain completely from her already pale face. I asked her if she remembered what she was doing while my son beat me 9 times in a row, calling me a pathetic loser and a parasite. She stuttered, unable to form a complete sentence. So I answered the question for her. I told her she was standing right by the tasting table, leaning against the expensive mahogany counter, facing the light. I told her she was holding the frames of her high-end smart glasses with both hands, perfectly framing and recording the entire assault. And most importantly, I reminded her that she was smiling. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table to close the distance between us. In that moment, you didn't look scared of your husband at all, I told her. You looked like you found it highly entertaining. I informed her that deleting that video from her physical device on Monday morning was a completely useless move. I explained that my attorney, Thomas, is a very thorough man. The second the police arrested Julian for armed home invasion on Monday night, Thomas contacted the district attorney and pushed for a massive aggravated charge of elder abuse against my son. As part of that immediate legal proceeding, Thomas subpoenaed the cloud backup servers linked to her cellular account. The police had already extracted the flawless, high-definition video of the entire assault. Chloe let out a suffocating gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. The reality of her situation finally crashed down on her. But I didn't stop there. I explained the legal consequences of her actions. I told her that the video didn't just prove Julian was a violent abuser, it proved she stood by and enthusiastically recorded a felony assault on an elderly person without ever trying to intervene or call for help. I told her the DA was currently preparing to serve her with accomplice charges and criminal conspiracy for her role in the attempted financial extortion. "You aren't getting a single dime from me to pay off your loan sharks," I said. "You're going to face the brutal consequences of your $1.5 million fraud entirely alone. By the time the people you owe money to finally lose your track, the local police will be waiting in line to handcuff you for elder abuse and wire fraud." I gave her one final look. "The absolute worst thing a person can do," I told her, "is mistake someone's patience for weakness." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a crisp $20 bill, and laid it on the table to cover my coffee. I stood up from my chair and calmly buttoned my suit jacket. Chloe was completely collapsed on the cafe floor, arms wrapped around her stomach, rocking back and forth in a state of total psychological shock. The other customers watched in stunned silence as I stepped right around her. I didn't look back. I walked out the front door and into the bright morning sun, leaving her to drown completely in the shallow grave she had spent the last 5 years digging for me. The gears of the criminal justice system turn incredibly slowly, but they grind with absolute precision. 6 agonizing months passed between that damp night. My son was arrested on my front porch, and the cold winter morning he finally faced trial. I walked into the Marin County Courthouse, wearing a well-tailored charcoal suit, feeling a sense of total detachment toward the man sitting at the defense table. Julian was no longer the golden boy of the corporate world. The expensive custom suits he used to define his entire identity were gone. Instead, he wore an oversized, bright orange state prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were locked in heavy steel chains that clanked loudly against the wooden table every single time he moved his body. His skin was paper pale, completely stripped of the confident tan he used to get on the luxury vacations I secretly funded. He looked small, he looked terrified. He looked like a man who finally understood that his actions carried irreversible consequences. The bailiff called my name, the sound echoing off the high, arched ceilings of the courtroom. I stood up from the gallery and walked slowly toward the witness stand. I passed Julian's table without giving him a single glance. I placed my hand on the leather Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, sat down, and adjusted the microphone. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with a zero-tolerance policy for domestic abusers, stood before me. She asked me to recount the events of the Thanksgiving gathering. I didn't cry. I didn't let my voice shake or show a single trace of sadness. I spoke with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing a fatal tumor. I methodically detailed the exact sequence of events. I explained how Julian backed me into the wine cellar, demanding my patent portfolio to cover up his failing business ventures. I described how he crowded into my personal space when I refused, and then I recounted the physical attack. I told the court exactly how he raised his right hand and slammed his palm into my face. I counted out the strikes for the court record loud and clear. 1, 2, 3. I repeated the exact insults he yelled with every single impact, calling me an old loser and a parasite. 4, 5, 6. I described how the sheer force of the blows shoved me backward into the wine racks, leaving deep contusions across my cheekbone. 7, 8, 9. Day. The defense attorney tried to object, claiming this was simply a heated verbal argument between a father and son that got slightly out of hand. The prosecutor didn't argue. She simply turned to the judge and introduced the state's primary piece of physical evidence. She requested permission to play the video clip subpoenaed directly from the cloud backup servers of Chloe's smart device, the exact file Chloe had frantically deleted from her physical phone the morning of Julian's arrest, hoping to erase her complicity. She didn't understand that nothing is ever truly deleted from corporate servers, especially when an attorney like Thomas knows exactly where to look. The courtroom lights dimmed, the large monitors facing the jury box and the judge flickered to life. The high-definition video began to play. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as the footage filled the screens. Everyone watched my son tower over me, his face twisted with vicious rage. The microphone on the premium smart glasses captured the audio with terrifying clarity. The entire room heard the loud, sickening thud of his hand striking my face. 9 distinct times. They heard him explicitly threaten to throw me into a state mental facility if I didn't hand over my money. But the most damaging part of the video wasn't Julian's violence. It was the background audio, the clear, unmistakable sound of Chloe laughing. The video panned slightly, showing her reflection in the climate-controlled glass door, watching her husband assault an elderly man and smiling. The visual evidence completely demolished the defense's narrative. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a criminal act of malicious elder abuse recorded for entertainment. The lights came back on. The judge, a stern man with decades of experience on the bench, stared at the defense table with pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian was openly weeping into his chained hands, completely broken by the public broadcast of his true nature. The judge was absolutely ruthless when delivering his verdict. He spoke directly to Julian, stating that in all his years presiding over criminal cases, he had rarely seen a defendant display such a profound level of arrogance and cruelty toward his own flesh and blood. The judge systematically listed the severe aggravating factors: the documented physical violence of elder abuse, the attempted extortion, and the premeditated armed home invasion involving a deadly weapon. The judge explained that carrying a ghost gun into a burglary showed a clear willingness to use lethal force to secure financial gain. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He stated that society must be protected from predators who believe their economic desires sit above human life. He handed down long consecutive sentences for both the armed burglary and the aggravated elder abuse charges. Julian was sentenced to serve 10 full years in a maximum security state prison. The judge explicitly ruled that the sentence would be served in full, with absolutely zero possibility of early parole or early release for good behavior. The heavy thud of the wooden gavel struck the block, sealing my son's fate. 2 burly bailiffs immediately grabbed Julian by the arms and pulled him up. He didn't look back at me. He just kept his head down, letting them drag him through the side door toward the holding cells, his heavy chains rattling the entire way. The trial was officially adjourned, but the absolute justice I had set in motion wasn't completely finished yet. Chloe was sitting in the very back row of the public gallery. She had attended the sentencing, hoping to quietly observe her husband's destruction from a safe distance. She believed she had successfully run from the fallout by throwing her husband to the wolves and painting herself as a victim. She stood up and smoothed out her cheap coat, feeling a sense of absolute relief that the ordeal was finally over. She turned to walk toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom, eager to disappear into the city and start looking for a new source of income. She never made it to the hallway. Before her hand could even touch the brass doorknob, 2 plainclothes investigators from the FBI and the district attorney's office stepped directly into her path, completely blocking the exit. One of the investigators reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope, handing it straight to her. Chloe took the envelope, her hands instantly starting to shake. The investigator spoke in a volume loud enough for the lingering reporters and the remaining people in the gallery to hear clear as day. He informed her that she was being officially served with multiple felony indictments. The DA had formally charged her with criminal conspiracy to commit extortion, based entirely on her active participation in the recorded assault. On top of that, the Financial Crimes Division had fully unraveled the forged property, documents she used to secure the $1.5 million shadow loan. She was being charged with felony wire fraud and grand theft. The investigator informed her that a judge had signed a warrant for her arrest just 10 minutes earlier. He instructed her to put her hands behind her back. Chloe dropped the manila envelope onto the polished floor. She let out a piercing scream, completely losing the last bit of composure she had left. She begged the investigators, crying out that she didn't have any money for a lawyer and that the private lenders would kill her if she was locked up in prison. The investigators completely ignored her. They snapped a pair of cold steel handcuffs around her wrists, locking them tight. They marched her straight back down the center aisle of the courtroom, parading her right past the empty defense table where her husband had just been convicted. I sat right there in the witness stand and watched her get dragged through the exact same side door where Julian had vanished. The trap I set the day they locked me out of my own money had snapped completely shut on both of them. They had walked into that courthouse thinking they were smart enough to outrun the consequences of their arrogance. They walked out in chains, completely destroyed by the truth. 365 days have passed since that heavy wooden gavel struck the block in the county courthouse. A whole year of heavy steel chains locking down the wrists of the people who thought they could abuse me with zero consequences. I don't live in the suburbs anymore. I left the manicured lawns, the HOAs, and that toxic proximity to my past life miles behind me. Right now, I'm standing on the wide, wraparound wooden deck of a newly built, off-grid high-tech cabin. It sits high up on a cliffside in the Pacific Northwest, along the Oregon coast, completely isolated from the noise of the city. The air up here is incredibly crisp and clean, smelling of old pine needles and fresh cedar. Directly below my property, a pristine ocean crashes against the jagged rocks with a deep, echoing roar. I am 69 years old today, and I have never felt healthier or more full of life. The chronic tension that used to live on my shoulders, the constant underlying anxiety of managing my son's chaotic financial disasters, is completely gone. The bruise on my face faded a long time ago, but the lesson it taught me is perfectly intact. I spend my mornings taking quiet walks along the cliffside and my evenings reading thick historical biographies by a massive stone fireplace in the living room. I don't have a TV, and I don't have social media accounts. I deliberately engineered an absolute beautifully quiet life for myself. The sound of tires slowly crunching over a long gravel driveway breaks the afternoon peace. I lean against the heavy wooden railing of the deck and watch a sleek black sedan pull up next to my truck. The driver's door opens and Thomas steps out. Surrounded by the towering pine trees, he looks completely out of place in his flawless, custom city suit, carrying his signature leather briefcase. But to me, he's a sight for sore eyes. He was the architect who helped me build that perfect legal fortress. I walk down the wooden steps to greet him, and we share a firm handshake. It's the handshake of two men who successfully completed a long, complex, and incredibly satisfying campaign. I lead Thomas up the stairs, inviting him to sit at a heavy oak table, placed in the corner of the deck overlooking the water. The late autumn afternoon sun casts long golden shadows across the wood. Thomas doesn't waste time with unnecessary small talk. He knows exactly why he drove 2 hours up this winding cliffside road. He lays his briefcase flat on the table, clicking open the brass latches. He pulls out a stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. This isn't a standard update on legal proceedings. This is the absolute final chapter of my estate planning. Sitting face to face, he explains the precise legal mechanisms he has put into place. When the commercial developer bought that house, along with the garage startup, last year, the massive 7-figure cash payment went directly into my primary holding account. For 12 months, that money sat safely right there, generating substantial interest. But as long as it remained under my personal name, there was always a tiny theoretical risk that some opportunistic lawyer might try to claim a right to it down the road. Thomas brought these documents to eliminate that risk permanently and completely. He slides the paperwork across the oak table, explaining that we are establishing an ironclad, irrevocable trust. Irrevocable is the most beautiful word in the entire legal dictionary. It means that once the ink dries on these papers, the transfer cannot be undone, altered, or challenged by anyone under any circumstances. I am permanently locking away the millions generated from the sale of my son's fake kingdom. But I'm not keeping it for myself. I have more than enough money to live out my remaining decades in absolute comfort. I look at the designated beneficiary listed on the front page of the trust. It's a National Alzheimer's Research and Pediatric Neuro Foundation based in Portland. It's an institution dedicated to treating and studying terminal illnesses, helping families facing unimaginable, cruel situations through absolutely no fault of their own. I am transferring the entirety of the house proceeds directly into their endowment fund. The money my son demanded to fund his arrogant vanity projects, the wealth he believed he was entitled to by blood, will now go toward buying advanced medical equipment, paying for the treatments of innocent patients, and honoring my late wife's name. Thomas points to a specific clause buried deep in the legal text. He reads it out loud just to make sure I fully appreciate his airtight work. The clause explicitly disinherits Julian and Chloe by name. It legally defines them as hostile actors and completely strips away any future right. They might have to contest my estate when I eventually pass away. Thomas tells me that even if Julian serves his full 10-year sentence and somehow manages to find an unprincipled lawyer willing to file a frivolous lawsuit, he will hit a solid brick wall. This money is legally and completely out of his reach for the rest of his life and for all eternity. I pick up the heavy gold pen resting on the papers. I look out over the pristine ocean, watching a pair of seagulls circle above the water. I don't feel a single twinge of regret. I'm not mourning the loss of my estate, because my true legacy is sitting right here on this table. I didn't leave a spoiled, violent heir. I left a massive shield of protection for people who actually need it. I press the tip of the pen to the paper and sign my name on the primary transfer line. I flip the page and sign the secondary authorizations. I initial right next to the specific disinheritance clause. With every single stroke of the pen, I feel the last remaining microscopic ties connecting me to my past severing completely. I push the finalized documents back across the table to Thomas. He reviews the signatures, stamps them with his official notary seal, and slides the paperwork back into his leather briefcase. The legal execution is officially complete. No more accounts to close, no more assets to liquidate, and no more hearings to attend. The board has been wiped completely clean. Thomas stands up and buttons his suit jacket. He declines my invitation to stay for dinner, mentioning that he needs to get down the mountain road before the dark completely sets in. He shakes my hand one last time, looks me in the eye, and tells me it was an absolute honor to represent me. I watch him walk down the stairs, get into his black sedan, and slowly drive away. The sound of his tires fades into the distance until the absolute silence of the cliffside settles back over my cabin like a heavy blanket of protection. I am completely alone, and I don't have a son. The man who shares my DNA is a convicted, violent felon, wearing an orange jumpsuit, sleeping on a thin mattress in a concrete cell. I don't have a daughter-in-law. The woman who laughed at my pain is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, facing a massive sentencing for conspiracy and fraud. They no longer exist in my reality. They are nothing more than cautionary tales, ghosts of a bad past that I successfully defeated. I step inside my warm cabin and walk into the rustic kitchen. I open the heavy wooden cabinet above the counter and pull down a bottle of top-shelf, locally distilled rye whiskey. I reach for a heavy crystal glass, the only piece of luxury I brought with me from my old life. I pour a generous measure of the deep amber liquid, the rich aroma of toasted oak and vanilla instantly filling the air. I didn't pour this glass to drown out any lingering sadness. I don't have any sadness left to drown. I walk back out onto the wooden deck, holding the heavy glass. The sun is just starting to dip below the jagged coastline in the distance, painting the sky in brilliant shades of deep purple and fiery orange. A cold Pacific breeze brushes against my face. I look out over the vast, beautiful emptiness of my new world. I raise the crystal glass, tilting it toward the fading sunlight. I take a deep breath of that incredibly clean air, take a sip of the warm rye whiskey, and feel the pleasant burn slide right down my chest. I stand there in that perfect, absolute silence, raising my glass to a flawlessly executed, untouchable freedom. If I learned one absolute truth from this entire ordeal, it's this: sharing the same blood doesn't give anyone the right to stomp all over your dignity. For years, I confused parental love with endless sacrifice, believing that if I just gave enough, my son would eventually respect me. But parasites don't respect the host. They just bleed them dry until there's nothing left. True peace doesn't come from silently enduring abuse to maintain a toxic family dynamic. It comes from having the absolute courage to draw an ironclad line in the sand and stand up for your own worth. You can never heal in the exact same environment that broke you.